In May 1999, Schuldiner began to complain of severe pain in the upper part of his neck. Initially, he thought he was just experiencing a pinched nerve. Later, after consulting and undergoing an MRI examination, Chuck had to accept the bitter reality that he was diagnosed with pontine glioma, a type of brain cancer that attacks the nerves around the head. A few months later, Chuck's family confirmed that his tumor had slowly started to shrink, and he was in a healing process. A year later, Chuck underwent surgery to remove the remnants of his tumor. The operation was successful, although his family bore a significant financial burden. Not staying idle, several metal communities raised funds to help with Chuck's treatment. 2 years later, in May 2001, the cancer began to re-emerge in Chuck. Many fellow rock musicians, including Korn, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Kid Rock, gathered to auction off their personal belongings. Chuck then received intensive chemotherapy treatment, but the side effects led to pneumonia. Shortly after, Chuck Schuldiner passed away on December 13, 2001, at the age of 34, and his body was cremated. Once again, the metal world had to mourn the loss of an influential figure. During his funeral ceremony, a series of renowned metal musicians such as Dave Grohl, Max Cavalera, Mike Patton, King Diamond, Corey Taylor, and Jason Newsted were present to pay their final respects to Chuck Schuldiner. At the beginning of his career with Death, Schuldiner used the death growl vocal technique. In Death's final album, The Sound of Perseverance, Chuck used a higher voice, and his vocal style was then widely imitated by various death metal bands at the time. According to Guitar World, Chuck Schuldiner ranks 20th among the 100 greatest metal guitarists, truly a versatile legend. Death wouldn't be as big and legendary today if it weren't for frontman Chuck Schuldiner. He was the mastermind behind Death's success. It's no wonder he's hailed as the Godfather of death metal. Born Charles Michael Schuldiner on May 13, 1967 in Long Island, New York, USA. Chuck has Jewish ancestry from his father, who was Austrian, and his mother, who was from South America, both practicing Judaism. He spent his childhood in Florida with his two siblings, Frank and Beth Ann. At the age of 9, Schuldiner began learning to play the guitar. Following the tragic death of his older brother, his parents intentionally gifted him a guitar instrument in the hopes that Chuck could overcome his grief from losing his sibling. As Schuldiner gradually grew into his teenage years, he idolized a range of rock and heavy metal elites, such as Metallica, Iron Maiden, Slayer, Kiss, Celtic Frost, and Billy Idol. Not only that, Chuck also paid extra attention to classical jazz music. As time went on, Chuck began forming a band called Mantas, the precursor to Death, when he was 16 years old. At that time, their lineup still consisted of the trio Chuck, guitar, Rick Ross, guitar, and Cam Lee, drums and vocals. Several years later, Chuck decided to move to Toronto and briefly joined the Canadian heavy metal group, Slaughter. Chuck eventually returned to focus on Mantas, which slowly transformed into Death. During this time, he recruited the talented young drummer Chris Reifert, who was only 17 years old at the time. Together with Reifert, Chuck produced one demo and one studio album, Mutilation, 1986, and Scream Bloody Gore, 1987, under the Combat Records label. Remarkably, during that time, Chuck handled guitar, vocal, and bass session takes simultaneously. In his debut album, Chuck collaborated for the first time with the renowned illustrator Ed Repka, who was previously famous for creating the iconic mascot for Megadeth, Vic Rattlehead. Slowly but surely, the name Death began to make waves among metalheads. A year after releasing the album Scream Bloody Gore, Chuck released the sophomore album titled Leprosy, 1988, via Combat Relapse Records. In this album, Death returned with their latest lineup. For their guitar position, Rick Ross decided to rejoin, with the addition of two new members, Bill Andrews, drums, and Terry Butler, bass. Moving on to the album Spiritual Healing, 1990, Death once again shuffled their lineup. This time, Rick Ross's position was replaced by James Murphy. This album also marked the end of collaboration with illustrator Ed Repka, after several previous album artworks were exclusively created by Ed. Since the release of the album Spiritual Healing, Chuck finally agreed to stop using full-time personnel. Chuck tended to work with additional musicians and live performers. Due to having an unharmonious relationship with previous personnel, Chuck began to gain a reputation as a perfectionist in the metal scene. Chuck also briefly fired his manager, Eric Greif, but rehired him for the subsequent releases. A year later, Death released the album Human, 1991. Unlike their previous works, Human showcased a more technical and progressive style. In this album, Chuck displayed all of his individual skills compared to previous albums. It's no wonder that with this leap in their sound, the album Human was credited as shaping a new subgenre called technical death metal. Successively, Death released a series of albums such as Individual Thought Patterns, 1993, Symbolic, 1995, and finally, The Sound of Perseverance, 1998. Throughout their journey in the music world, Chuck didn't hesitate to inject controversial themes into his lyrics, such as anti-drug themes, living monstrosity, and even sensitive topics like abortion, altering the future. Outside of his activities with Death, Chuck Schuldiner was involved in several other heavy music projects. One notable project is the progressive metal band called Control Denied and the supergroup Voodoo Cult, alongside Dave Lombardo, Slayer, and Mila Petrota, Creator. With Control Denied, Chuck successfully released one studio album, The Fragile Art of Existence, 1999. Additionally, Chuck also provided guest vocals for Dave Grohl's heavy metal project, Probot. During the peak of his career, Chuck became closely associated with the title, The Godfather of Death Metal.